If you go looking for socialist utopian fiction, you'll have a reading list rather quickly, but libertarian fiction worth reading is notably thinner on the ground. Partly because libertarians tend to want to explain things at length, and that gets annoying in a novel. Hell, it gets annoying in person. By about the third time hearing a shockingly legalistic argument for why some action doesn't actually violate the NAP, I really start to miss the relative consistency of Marxists prattling about theoretical distinctions of property. But then there's The Probability Broach by L. Neil Smith. Serious enough about its theory to make good points, yet bonkers enough to not read like a manifesto. It's absolutely utopian, far from a workable blueprint for political and social reforms, yet it serves as an illustration both of some serious blind spots in libertarian thinking and in its critics. And if we peel back the sometimes heavy-handed surface layers, it points to something we really need to think about if we want a better society, as well as some overlap between seemingly opposite ideologies that can be a little uncomfortable. We begin with Detective Win Bear, Denver PD, investigating the death of a university physicist. The United States that he lives in is much worse than I remember 1987 being, with a national police force like something out of J. Edgar Hoover's dreams, a ban on the private possession of precious metals, highly restrictive gun laws, high crime, high pollution, an over-regulated, economically stagnant, authoritarian hellhole. But Detective Bear's investigation takes a turn. After a gunfight at a university lab, he's caught in an explosion and awakens, burned and aching, in a peaceful green park. Here and there, other people were dancing, talking in small groups, lying in pairs under leafy canopies, moving gently with the music. They wore a bewildering variety of costumes: bright, swirly cloaks, skirts or kilts, trousers and tunics, riots of color strewn like shining flowers across the forested lawn. Hunched and feeble in my tattered suit, I clutched miserably at some hostile stranger's pistol in my pocket. My knees and elbows were caked with mud. The more he looks around, the more unfamiliar it all becomes. It slowly dawns on him that he's not in Denver anymore, and wherever he is, open carry is the norm. I labored along, people staring at me a little and me staring right back. Whatever the local ordinances were, I saw more low-slung handguns, more dirks and daggers than in a dozen B-westerns and swashbucklers spliced together reel to reel. There hadn't been a hardware collection like this since the Crusades were catered. When he finds what he takes to be a phone booth, a little kiosk labeled telecom, he's surprised to be greeted by an animated operator who is unable to connect him to the Denver Police Department. There are no police departments, or a city of Denver. Also, there are Mars colonies. At first, he thinks he pulled a Buck Rogers, slept through a cataclysm and awoke in the distant future. Only after finding his own name in the directory does he start to realize he's in some kind of alternate Earth, one where America took some very different turns. The big turning point appears to be the outcome of the Whiskey Rebellion. The short version. In 1791, the newly created federal government was carrying a rather substantial war debt and tried to raise money, in part through taxes on domestically produced goods, one of them being whiskey. Yeah, they thought that was a good idea in a country that just fought a war over taxes. In part, we can argue over that later. The farmers distilled a lot of their grain. It wasn't just that they liked a good bourbon, though no one at the time would know what that meant, but distilling whiskey was an important part of their livelihood and a primary trade good. Attempts to impose the tax went about as well as you'd expect. Mass noncompliance and periodic violence against tax collectors went on until 1794, when George Washington decided he'd had enough and led a few thousand troops out to quash the uprising. Things fizzled pretty quick after that, in part thanks to Albert Gallatin, a wealthy Pennsylvania landowner and briefly U.S. Senator who worked for a peaceful solution. Later he was Jefferson's Treasury Secretary, but that's another story. Despite being anti-federalist himself, thanks in large part to his efforts, the rebels were talked down. Alexander Hamilton got his way, and the precedent was set. But in this other America, things went differently. Gallatin didn't take the moderate route, but instead lent his oratory and material support to the rebels. And they won. Not only was the tax scrapped, but the new constitution that had allowed it was tossed out as a betrayal of the revolution, and Washington was executed as a traitor. Hamilton and the rest of the Federalists buggered off to safer places, and the American experiment in liberty went in a much more fundamentalist direction. I say fundamentalist with shades of meaning. Not only do they take individual liberty and property rights very seriously, but there's some French Revolution aspects to it. It wasn't just a political reset. They replaced English measures with the system of Jefferson's design, metric ounces and such. This other America also started a new calendar, beginning with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The story takes place not in 1987, but in the year 211 Anno Liberatus. The whole year zero thing to mark the new regime always gives me pause. Detective Bear finds this all rather perplexing, not least because it's been dumped on him after another gunfight and waking up in the expert medical care of Clarissa, a healer who not only tends to his wounds, but whom he also finds quite attractive. Romantic subplot. She tries to answer his questions, nonsensical as they seem, about this North American Confederacy he finds himself in. Hold it, Confederacy? Let me think. Who won the Civil War? Civil War? She blinked. At least it was a change from head shaking. You can't mean this country unless you mean the whiskey. I mean the war between the states, tariffs and slavery, Lee and Grant, Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, 1861 to 1865. Lincoln gets killed in the end. Very sad. Clarissa looked very sad. Systematic delusions written all over her face. I don't know what you're talking about. In the first place, slavery was abolished in 44 AL, very peaceably thanks to Thomas Jefferson. In short, everything is better. It's a libertarian paradise where everyone lives well and the government, what little of it there is, stays out of the way. Quite literally, it's based in an isolated corner of North Dakota to make it inconvenient for everyone. Crime is dealt with through private security in civil cases, and medical science extends lifespans to well over a century. There is a Continental Congress, but it doesn't meet regularly. It's not anarchy, but it keeps governance to a bare minimum and remains suspicious even of that, and the people are better for it. People in this case includes not only humans, all humans, but also chimpanzees, gorillas, and dolphins. Sure, I'll roll with it. But of course there are people who think that things would be even better if it had more government. Maybe a side of taxes. Yes, the Federalists are the bad guys here. Led by a John J. Madison, who it turns out is actually Manfred von Richthofen. Yes, the Red Baron. I told you this was bonkers. Opposing them are Wynne, his other self Ed, Clarissa the healer, and Lucy Kropotkin. It's a wacky adventure story, and you can read it as such without having to dig too much deeper into it. I'm not going to get too much into that side of it, though. Because hanging over the whole thing is the idea of property rights as the core of all rights, which for many triggers the assumption that a profit-driven, dog-eat-dog, hyper-capitalist dystopia is the logical end state. The argument usually goes something like this. Without a government to regulate industries, there's nothing to stop a corporation from dumping toxic waste into the river. All the plants die and the kids get cancer, and you can't even send an angry letter to the corporation because there's no post office in your stupid ANCAP fantasy. Setting aside that a corporation is just a government-granted legal status to shield the individual members from personal responsibility for business debts, this misses the other half of the argument, because if you build that factory and the sludge runs downriver to my land, for example, I can't call the EPA. But I can get a bunch of the other landowners together and go blow up your factory, and you can't call the cops to come and stop us. Now, maybe you can hire some mercenaries to protect the factory and all the supply deliveries coming in, but at that point it quickly becomes cheaper to just not dump sludge in the river, not to mention the bad publicity and resultant loss of market share. Anyone interested in sustained profit has a strong incentive to reach some kind of accommodation. Many will say that that's simplistic, barbaric, or unworkable, and perhaps it is. It's also the foundation of our global political order, compromising with people we don't like in order to avoid massive violence and the cost that incurs. It doesn't always work, but more often than not it does. The society described in this book just assumes scaling it down to smaller units, often down to the individual. It almost certainly wouldn't result in the utopian society of advanced technology alongside sprawling green spaces the book presents, but visions of bubbling toxic hellscapes ruled over by an evil corporate conglomerate in the absence of massive government oversight is no less an ideologically warped fantasy. Now, there's a good case to be made for a causal connection between capitalism and new technology, in that everyone is pressured to maximize profit, and developing new tech, while risky, has enormous upside potential. That, coupled with consistently enforced patent laws, creates a built-in structural pressure. But conflating libertarian and capitalist is a mistake. They can overlap and coexist, but are not synonymous. And if you truly have a libertarian or minarchist political system, you lose a lot of the external pressure that props up capitalism. You can't bleed off money through taxes and fines, for example, reducing the pressure on working people that locks them deeper into wage labor. Intellectual property becomes difficult to enforce. You can't sue competitors out of business even if they rip off your idea. Consequently, the upside of expensive R&D is substantially reduced. I would expect that the kind of society laid out in this book would be less technologically advanced, but significantly more chill than our own. Whether that's a good or bad thing depends very much on one's priorities. And while I tend to be sympathetic to libertarian ideas, they do tend to overemphasize the market as the answer to all problems. It's the flip side of the Marxist focus on economic factors as the core driver of human action. Both ideologies tend to assume that we can have all the material goodies of capitalism without all the downsides. It's not just a question of markets or class disparities. There is a vast field of cultural priorities and assumptions as well. We live in a culture that pushes us to maximize personal wealth. Part of that can be blamed on capitalism, but there's a feedback loop between the methods of maximizing profit and the social pressure to maximize profit. Capitalism is part of how the modern world functions due to a confluence of several factors, from population density to industrial technology. It's not simply a big scam dreamed up by a cabal one day. No one was sitting around in the Middle Ages thinking, let's replace this feudalism thing with wage laborers competing in an open market for their skills and get locked into constant competition for market share with each other. Remember that capitalism is a term first used by socialists as a critique of the system that had evolved, not a self-applied term for a deliberately constructed ideology. And that socialist critique generally assumes that, in the absence of a restraining state in some form, business owners will use up resources in pursuit of short-term gain, like some kind of profit-maximizing AI, leaving the world a barren wasteland and letting infrastructure collapse except for their walled-off estates. But it doesn't actually work out that way. We have more overall wealth and in many markets more competition than ever before. The monopolies are mostly the result of states creating barriers to entry rather than the inexorable march of capitalism to its own destruction. The predictive aspect of Marxist theory fails entirely. But if we simply decided to switch to completely unregulated markets and everything tomorrow, libertarian theory would faceplant just as hard. Our cultural context doesn't produce natural ANCAPs or the new Soviet man. And there's a tendency all around to forget that these ideologies started as proposed solutions to problems, but then ossified into ends in and of themselves. You can't have a dialogue with the zealots because they're no longer considering the problems. Instead, they become invested in an ideology. They're trying to win arguments, not find solutions. This is why I don't really engage with people online in political debates anymore. My reaction is usually, I don't believe that you believe that. The country depicted in the Probability Broach isn't just based on a different set of laws. It's running on a very different set of cultural assumptions and priorities. Today's ideologies, left and right alike, tend to weigh economic motives very heavily at the expense of others, but that's not all that motivates people. For example, wealthy people don't give to charity for profit. They do it for a multitude of reasons, including status. This was even more pronounced in the past. Most of the great structures of the past were built at great expense for reasons other than short-term returns. The Parthenon was not built as a shopping mall, and Europe's great cathedrals weren't built because some bishop thought it would turn a quick profit. Obviously, this isn't an either-or binary, it's a spectrum. There were people motivated primarily by the pursuit of wealth in the ancient world, just as wealthy philanthropists are a thing that exists today. The point is that social and cultural factors favor one over the other, and in today's world, we collectively tend to favor ostentatious displays of personal wealth higher as signifiers of status than, say, building a library. By that same token, trying to analyze the world described in the Probability Broach or libertarianism in general, purely in profit-seeking terms, just ends in nonsense. One of the most interesting aspects to this book, and the one that I think makes it appealing to libertarians while seeming laughable to everyone else, is that it acknowledges that different cultural mindset without specifically calling it out in those terms. Their perception of history is viewed from a radically different perspective. To most Americans, it's a succession of battles, wars, presidents, and kings. To Confederates, history's Thomas Edison's mean a lot more than its Lyndon Johnson's. Inventions, ideas, philosophies are central. Invasions and elections are temporary aberrations. So from that standpoint, a person who became wealthy by, say, patent trolling or predatory financialization, and then did nothing with that wealth beyond ostentatiously showing it off, would have rather low social standing. They wouldn't be an example people would want to emulate, unlike our own world. It doesn't have to be like this. And on that note, the posited history of this book's world has some interesting turns. So after the Whiskey Rebellion, the people prosper under a very libertarian structure. Later, under the presidency of Lysander Spooner, it's refined into the North American Confederation the book depicts. If it truly does govern best that governs least, the Confederation is governed extremely well. And it isn't in a vacuum. The effects are felt throughout the world, one of the most notable being that with the successful libertarian sort of system prospering, the 19th and 20th century dissident movements take a very different turn, as Wynne finds out when he studies their history. Nothing about Karl Marx, socialism, or communism. European revolts in the 1840s are called Galatinite. Revolutionary socialism would have been superfluous in that timeline. An alternative to kings and masters was already in play and delivering positive results. And yet, the underlying forces are still at work, producing many parallels. The Tsar is still overthrown in a Russian Revolution, though not until the 1950s. Today, the hoe and spanner symbolize the birth of Russian liberty. It suggests that the American Revolution was the real liberation movement, the realization that we don't need kings or hereditary nobility, that we can govern ourselves, and socialism is a perversion of that. It's not a comparison made directly in the book, but it's one that I think has some merit. It's all outlandish fiction with a heavy ideological bent, of course, but then so are most political movements. But there's something we can learn from outlandish fiction of both varieties. In this case, there is a level of mutual respect and social cohesion implied in that society that allows it to function despite being wide open to abuses. It's not a system that forces people to be good, but rather a high-trust assumption made possible both by a shared idea of liberty and an awareness of immediate consequences for violating it. Nobody runs things here except their own business and folks that have other cravings. She patted the holster on her hip. It's not something that we currently have. I've talked to a lot of libertarians over the years that focus on the corrosive effect of overbearing laws and the importance of economic freedom, but don't give much attention to how none of what they propose works without a culture that values autonomy, reputation, and the importance of differing ideas as a troubleshooting mechanism more than just an open path to profit-seeking or self-gratification. We're not in the same kind of culture as the founders lived in, and we're certainly not enlightened anarchists. The progressive left has a related problem. Their stated goals of fair distribution and equity require a high level of social cohesion, which they systematically destroy through their tactics of identity division, trying to build a house while ripping up the foundation. The broad point being that society isn't just laws and systems, it's built on cultural foundations and social assumptions. The whole, we need less government, no, we need a stronger state, back and forth, is a fixation on one piece at the expense of the others. Sort of like trying to fix a truck, but all you know how to do is change tires. It's important, but it's not nearly enough. And the North American Confederacy understands that, at least on some level. They have a plan to deal with the threat from the other side of the broach, that oppressive world that Wynne came from. The Confederacy has decided to strike back. Not against the Hamiltonians, who were never regarded as a significant threat, but against SecPol and the culture that allows such an abomination to exist. And not with Confederate A-bombs or troops, but in the same way that Sequoia won the Mexican War, with ideas. They're not a bunch of oblivious isolationists hoping the rest of the world leaves them alone. They're every bit as interventionist as the United States of our own world. They just do it in the cultural and philosophical space rather than direct military or economic action. In some ways, it's more like the Soviet model. Stir up revolutionary movements in other countries and let the old regimes bleed out. It still has most of the key elements that define America. It's built on a highly individualistic frontier culture. It's innovative and unruly. It's confident that its way is the best way and tends to see itself as the center and leader of the world. And it's eager to insert itself into the affairs of other nations, though the mechanism is very different. Which is perhaps a subtle acknowledgement that under the circumstances of the nation's founding, Hamilton was right. Philosophically, I lean more anti-federalist. But the 13 colonies didn't exist in a vacuum. There was a wider world full of other powers. A federal government and a national bank absolutely can be a threat to liberty. But so were European empires at their borders. Governments really can't protect their people from each other worth a damn, but they can do a passable job of protecting them from other governments. And there's a central aspect to this story that, while a bit hokey in the execution, really speaks to some essential but deeply buried aspect of the American character. Winbear, after meeting his other self, is at first baffled how in a world with so many changes, an identical twin of himself still managed to be born in it. He first theorizes that perhaps it's because he's an American Indian. His family has deeper ties to the land and was partially insulated from the rapid changes in the white man's world. But later observations throw that theory to the winds. It's a lingering mystery, finally leading to the philosophical realization that history isn't determined by some mysterious impersonal machinery, but by people deciding whether to use their minds or slough it off. In this world, Jefferson decided to insert that one little word. Winbear and Edbear don't exist in twinned reality because they're both Indians, but because they, their ancestors, decided they would. History be damned. That's why there are 2 Jennies, 2 Marion Morrisons, 2 Mark Twains. A Smith & Wesson beats 4 aces. Human will beats random chance. The mystical forces of history are so much buffalo dung, a fact both encouraging and a little scary. The old alibis won't wash anymore. We're responsible, and nothing's ever written indelibly on that wall. Individual agency rather than systems. It's following the logic of the American Revolution to its conclusion. We don't need kings, we can rule ourselves. And if that's true, we don't need the substitute kings of laws to protect us from ourselves, taxes to fund those enforcers, and the conceit that a 51-49 election equates to collective consent. And we don't need to rely on theories of historical forces, dialectical mechanisms to explain the world as it is, because we made it this way and we can change it. Being a voter isn't enough. You have to be an engaged human being, always learning, trying to understand, accepting that a lot of people will never agree with you, will never like you, and that their merely existing isn't a problem, but that you're under no obligation to play anyone's bullshit power games either. Right, that one word of Jefferson's that changed everything. Their Declaration of Independence is different by a single word: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the unanimous consent of the governed. Unanimous. The difference is staggering for a nation that takes its founding documents seriously. Whether that's still true of ours is questionable, but I have to acknowledge that while the Federalist Constitution may have its shortcomings, those white guys with their dusty wigs have done far more for human freedom than any politician, activist, or revolutionary since. And a world where the likes of Alexander Hamilton are the big authoritarian monsters would be a magnificent world indeed. Few things say politically homeless like this wardrobe choice.